Presentation. Next, we welcome Patrick Johnson from Trans-European Division, who has presentation Health on the Margins, Minimizing the Trauma of Health Essentially.
Good morning. This paper is divided into three parts. Part one suggests why the Adventist concept of health can have a traumatic impact on people with disabilities. The second part considers the challenge of ableism. And the third part gives two suggestions for creating welcoming communities. So part one. Some authors have pointed out that the acceptance of people with disabilities depends on the discourse present within the Christian faith community. And one of the prevailing discourses within the Adventist Church is that of health, so it's no surprise that the Church is known perhaps foremost for the benefits our members derive from our emphasis on health. We attribute this somewhat unique insight to the writings of one of our pioneers, Ellen White. For example, here's one of her quintessential purpose statements on health reform. In teaching health principles, keep before the mind the great object of reform, that its purpose is to secure the highest development of body and mind and soul. Show that the laws of nature, being the laws of God, are designed for our good, that obedience to them promotes happiness in this life and aids in the preparation for the life to come. From this, we can see that Mrs. White believed that health reform was 1, theocentric, 2, based on a holistic anthropology, and 3, meant to promote the well-being of all individuals. Briefly probing the significance of the latter two beliefs will illustrate how the Adventist concept of health can have a traumatic impact on people with disabilities. So Adventist health and wholeness. In mentioning the development of body and mind and soul, Ellen White illustrates the type of holistic anthropological thinking that is typical within Adventism. Ginger Hanks Harwood summarizes the significance of the idea of wholeness in the following way. The doctrine of wholeness has had a significant impact on the Adventist Church. Its presence can be demonstrated in our theology, anthropology, ecclesiology, and ethics. It has provided the Church with a central part of its identity and sense of mission. It would be hard to envision the history of the Church without the doctrine of wholeness, since this theme is woven into almost every recurrent theme and doctrine of the Church. The main ethic coming from wholeness is that the medium is indeed the message. In other words, the gospel is to be embodied by those who proclaim it. Ellen White seemed to underline this in order to stress the importance of health reform. However, the potential disadvantage of this is that one could infer that a certain norm or standard of health is expected to accompany the proclamation of the gospel. This could leave the subconscious impression that the healthier a person is, the more they are seen as representative of the message that God wants to give to the world. In other words, wholeness can lead to a form of health essentialism. Such an attitude could potentially become problematic for people with disabilities, for it raises a question of whether they are seen as enjoying the same level of health as everyone else. Are people with disabilities viewed as being in some way below the normal standard of health, however that may be defined, and thus seen as less useful in the mission of the Church? How does Adventism's innate drive towards wholeness react, for example, to the presence of a person with a chronic, incurable condition? Adventist health and individual responsibility. Another way in which the Adventist focus on health can potentially be disadvantageous for people with disabilities is in emphasizing individual responsibility for health. Naturally, health is a personal commodity, and the onus to live according to recommended principles of health lies with the individual. At the same time, whenever health reform is sought in a community of people, there's also the risk of generating a kind of elitism, where it's possible to single out groups who do not seem to comply with the expected norm. This is very reminiscent of the medical approach to disability, which sees disability residing with the individual who needs assistance from the medical profession to fix their problem. Similarly, if disability is viewed solely as a problem of the individual member, then those members can easily be seen as needing help from others. Could this be said to give rise to attitudes of pity, offers of unsolicited intercessory prayer, comments implying lack of faith on the part of people with disabilities, bringing lack of healing, and a general lack of empathy for a person with a chronic condition? In other words, could it be said that patronizing attitudes are a natural consequence of Adventism's underlying individual health emphasis? Thus, the issue for the Adventist Church is that our holistic anthropology, when combined with an emphasis on individual responsibility for health, can result in a form of health essentialism that discriminates against people with disabilities. That is to say, there's a theoretical danger of the Adventist health message having a trauma-inducing effect on people with disabilities due to it producing ableist attitudes. So part two, the challenge of ableism. Ableism is discrimination in favor of non-disabled people. It assumes that being non-disabled is the default, and anything outside of this is abnormal and undesirable. In other words, it's the idea that people with disabilities are not the same as normal people, and their lives are intrinsically less valuable than those who are non-disabled. And ableism can also be distinguished from disableism, which emphasizes discrimination directly against disabled people. Since the World Health Organization's first attempt in 1980 at a universal definition of disability, society has become more aware of how prevalent ableism is. As a result, most countries have some form of legislation outlining the political, social, and economic rights of people with disabilities. This legislation has ensured that public buildings and institutions now have physical access for people with disabilities. But there is a downside to this. Wheelchair accessible ramps in a building can signal that a church is disability friendly, while masking a deficiency of deep communality in the congregation in general, and a lack of acceptance of people with disabilities in particular. Some have captured this in the idea that narrow doorways are more easily rectified than narrow mindsets. Are ableist attitudes a problem in the Adventist Church? My research into the lived experience of people with disabilities involved in-depth interviews with Seventh-day Adventist Church members in the UK with physical disabilities. Their responses showed a wide spectrum of experiences that can be illustrated as spanning a continuum from negative through mixed to positive experiences. On the negative side, the experiences of the research participants can be summarized as illustrating insignificance, discrimination, and stereotyping, while the mixed experiences illustrate ministry inclusion and occasional insensitivity. Insignificance is used to describe the experience of feeling that as an individual you're not regarded as an important member in the life of the church. You feel you are of so little value to the community that if you're not present, you will not be missed. It's being left with the impression that you are undervalued and seen as a liability rather than an asset. Discrimination describes the experience of being deliberately treated unfairly or prejudicially because of one's disability. Stereotyping is where disability is viewed as something negative and treated as a problem of the individual without any communal responsibility. Ministry inclusion was a mixed experience, because while it should be obvious that total member involvement also includes people with disabilities, sometimes inclusion only comes as a result of persistence on the part of the person with disabilities. Insensitivity is a result of thoughtless and unguarded comments. As one participant commented, the disability in itself is easy to cope with compared with how people see you. Sometimes when people open their mouths, it leaves me questioning myself, do they think you don't have feelings? Part 3, becoming a church for everyone. To counteract ableism and become more welcoming to people with disabilities, the Adventist Church needs to do at least 2 things. Number 1, be conscious of the language it uses, and number 2, be intentional in using the Bible to inspire positive attitudes. Ableist language primarily starts with definitions, and disability definitions can be organized into 3 broad models: medical, social, and intersectional. The medical model of defining disability has been useful in providing society with a vocabulary for describing disabilities in the form of labels and classifications. This has resulted in increased expertise and specialization in many different conditions. However, medical classifications have an underlying notion of normal functioning against which disability is measured. Thus, they invariably portray disability using negative language. This ableist attitude results in a power imbalance where the disabled person becomes a passive recipient of treatment by an all-powerful medical profession, and furthermore, relying only on medical definitions accentuates a person's pathology. Thus, we end up associating people with their condition rather than seeing them as unique individuals. The social model of disability emphasizes a minority rights idea of disability. It makes a distinction between impairment and disability, and thus disability can be seen as a social construct, a category that's imposed on an individual by society. Hence, it is possible to speak of impairment being located in a person's physiology, disability being the social result of the impairment, and handicap being the disadvantage that comes from the impairment or disability. As a result, the term disabled people has become the label of choice, particularly by activist groups. In other words, being abled or disabled is primarily a result of social structures. This makes disability the responsibility of society and not an individual. Thus, the attitude of ableism is the cause of the problem of disability, not physical impairment. The social model of defining disability has led to law-based equality for people with disabilities. However, because of its focus on ableism, one of the main challenges with the social model is that it can be in danger of downplaying the very real physical and emotional impact of impairments. If taken to the extreme, the social model could lead to the opposition of all attempts to cure or rehabilitate medical conditions. Hence, for example, the debate around cochlear implants for deaf children. Even though the medical and social models have long provided the dominant discourse for understanding and theorizing disability, postmodern reasoning has moved the discussion beyond this binary. Instead, disability is being understood as the sum of complex interrelations between a person and their surroundings. Intersectional definitions attempt to take into consideration a more comprehensive understanding of the complexity of human identity. So they can consider how such things as race and gender impact on the experience of disability. Given that acceptable terminology for disability is ever evolving, and what might be considered politically correct today might be unacceptable tomorrow, the safest way for the church to avoid ableist language would be to learn to use people-first terminology. For example, referring to someone as a person with a seizure disorder rather than an epileptic. Disability does not define a person, so our first aim is to get to know the individual. Regarding using the Bible to inspire positive attitudes, it's important to recognize that God's attitude of favor towards all people, including those with disabilities, is repeatedly featured in the Old Testament. For example, when Moses attempted to use his speech impediment as an excuse not to answer the divine call to leadership, he was reassured that a person's disability was no hindrance for God. In Isaiah 56, marginalized people are promised that they will no longer be sidelined or forgotten, but that they belong in God's house of prayer for all nations. Similarly, in Jeremiah 31, people with disabilities are specifically mentioned among the people who will return from exile and have God as their shepherd. In the New Testament, we find an example of an ableist attitude expressed in the question of the disciples in John chapter 9. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? They were voicing the common belief in the link between sin and disability. In contrast, Jesus clearly denied any connection between sin and the man's disability. Instead, he gave the following reason in John 9, verse 3. This happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. At first sight, it may seem that the work of God that was displayed was his physical healing. However, Jesus made plain earlier in John 6, verse 29, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. This was clearly revealed by the man himself testifying, he is a prophet. In John 9:17, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. John 9:33. And more specifically, his direct confession and worship of Jesus. In John 9:38. Thus we can say that it was not so much the healing of disability, but rather the man's faith in Jesus that was revealed in the story. In other words, Jesus' healing ministry was illustrative of God's continued attitude of favor towards humans and how he takes the initiative to restore trust to the relationship. Hence, when Jesus healed a crippled woman on the Sabbath, he illustrated the dignified way he viewed her by referring to her as a daughter of Abraham. So in conclusion, the Adventist Church has been blessed with a health message. One direction in which this needs to be developed is to emphasize the importance of communal health. Devon Stahl offers a corrective that is worthwhile reflecting. Quote, our current Christian communities must become less concerned with individual health and instead recover a Christian conception of communal health. This is not to say that individual disease or disability should be overlooked. Rather, caring for those with disability or disease must be understood as a political and inherently eschatological act. Our current understanding of health, which is a wholly individualized commodity, has obscured Christ's vision of God's kingdom. End quote. If we were to expand our health emphasis beyond individual duty and focus more on communal responsibility, the cultural shift needed to create an inclusive environment for people with disabilities would become possible. We would no longer be blinded by ableist attitudes that focus on what a person is unable to do or view people with disabilities as simply needing our benevolent support. Rather, we would be concerned with exemplifying the multifaceted nature of the kingdom of God by recognizing the possibilities that all members embody. By upholding the dignity of everyone as individuals created in the image of God, we will be more reflective of the church described in 1 Corinthians 12. God has combined the members of the body and has given each greater honor and has given greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. Thank you very much.